G'day, we're here at the Giles Conservation Park and we're going to be looking for some ruins today, the Giles Ruins. I think there's a bit of an interesting history, maybe some stories about these that we can check out, and going to go for a wander. It's about 2 kilometres down this trail and see if we can find them. I'm heading down along these tracks here into the valley in Giles Conservation Park, and looking for an area that used to be known as the Reedbeds, and the remains of what was there before in the way of gardens. There was some commercial nurseries and gardens down there, and the people that also lived there and looked after those gardens and worked there, trying to see what's left from them. It's a bit of a historical site. But the story really begins with a man named Charles Giles. Giles came from Devon in England, where he'd trained as a horticulturalist. Before that, before he was known for gardens and orchards, he lived a very different life. He served as an officer in the Royal Marines, and in 1827 was wounded at the Battle of Navarino off the coast of Greece during the Greek War of Independence. 12 years later, in 1839, Charles and his wife Hannah left England aboard a ship called the Recovery, bound for the newly established colony of South Australia. It took them about 4 months, and when they arrived, South Australia had only been established as a British colony for a few years. Before Giles ended up here in the hills, he was living down at Black Forest. He was looking for somewhere to establish a nursery, and apparently on weekends he'd walk up into the Adelaide Hills looking for suitable land. He'd even carry a spade with him so he could stop along the way, dig into the ground and check out the soil. Eventually in 1846 he found what he was looking for near Norton Summit. He bought about 82 acres for just £1 an acre and started developing the property that became known as Grove Hill. In the early days, it was pretty basic. Giles apparently camped under an old gum tree while the house was being built. He'd come up from Black Forest on a Monday with enough provisions for the week, work on the property, and then head home again on Saturday. He started planting orchards, gardens, and nursery stock, and wanted to work out how to use the water naturally, which was flowing through the valleys, which he did with the channels. And the business did really well. South Australia was still a young colony, and there was a growing demand for fruit trees and flowers and ornamental plants. And getting plants here from overseas wasn't real easy either. Plants coming from England had to survive months at sea and were transported in what were known as Wardian cases. Basically small enclosed glass cases, a bit like a miniature greenhouse, designed to keep the plants alive during the voyage. Even then, not everything survived the journey, so being able to grow and propagate plants locally was really important, and there was a genuine need for what Giles was producing. It wasn't all plain sailing though. About 10 years after he'd established the orchard, a fire started on a neighbouring property and got out of control, swept through Grove Hill and apparently destroyed about 60 acres of orchard. That would have been absolutely devastating after all the work that had gone into it. But Giles didn't give up. He replanted, rebuilt the business, and just kept on going. And it became successful again, eventually employing dozens of people and becoming well known for its fruit, flowers, and nursery plants. As I get further down, the valley starts to open up, and one of the first things I notice is the vegetation. There's a definite change down here. Mixed in amongst the native bush are trees and plants that obviously don't belong here naturally, and it's the first real clue that this valley was once something very different. Somewhere down here are the remains of 3 old gardeners' cottages, which were given the names Hope, Faith and Charity. Before long, I came across the first stone ruins. I'm pretty confident I've located the first of the 3. It's a simple little stone cottage, but you can clearly make out 3 separate rooms. And walking around inside, you really start to get a feel for how small and basic these places would have been to live in. But it would have been a beautiful spot. The cottage looks out across the trees towards a creek bed. Right in the middle of that would have once been Giles gardens and orchards. It's hard to picture it now. It's just so overgrown. It's surrounded by bush, but back then there would have been people working around, trees and gardens being tended, and water would have been flowing around through the channels that had been built through the valley. After spending a bit of time looking around in the cottage, it was time to move on. I've found one, but hope, faith, and charity means there should still be another 2 ruins somewhere further down the valley, and finding those is going to prove a little bit more difficult due to the conditions. After leaving the cottage, I kept following the track further down. It looks like it's like a road that maybe the rangers will drive their 4-wheelers or utes down perhaps. And that one goes down the valley, which is quite open, and further down start seeing on the right hand side it's opening up a bit more into a valley to the right hand side, and my thinking was that's probably where a good chance there's more ruins down there. And the problem is I just couldn't get to it. The water was just getting too deep, and I wasn't wanting to get completely saturated, and also there was a lot of blackberries and very overgrown. There was no clear path to get through anywhere there. I know that the slate-lined channels were on the right hand side. Once again, I just couldn't get to them, so I kept following the track further ahead, keeping an eye out to see if there's any way to get over there. And eventually I backtracked and found a spot where I could cross the creek and scramble up the embankment on the other side. And I was thinking, if I can't get to the valley from below, maybe I can climb up and get down on the other side. And from there it started getting a bit rough. It was pretty slippery. The ground was getting steeper, the vegetation was getting pretty thick, and soon there was really not any tracks. I was following animal tracks, I think they were, and I was finding some evidence that it looked like I found some stone retaining wall, and also evidence of a fence, some steel posts that were there. So I've got a feeling the gardens may have terraced up that hill, and it started to seem a bit more appealing that turning around might be the better way to go, but thought I'd push on a little bit further, and then managed to spot a couple of old rainwater tanks down in the valley, and that sort of kept me going a bit further in the thought that there might be some ruins down there around those tanks. And I pushed on. It started to get a bit steep and slippery coming down into the valley. Managed to get down to the bottom, but the further I pushed on into the valley, I only made it like 10 or 15 meters, and it was just too deep, too wet, and my pants were getting ripped up. I was getting scratched by blackberry thorns, and there was just nowhere sensible left to go. I made it to one of the iron tanks, but it was too overgrown. I couldn't get in to have a look. I eventually made my way back down into the main valley, And after that, I decided there's an easier way to get a better look at this place. So I get the drone out. From the air, you get a completely different perspective of the valley. I did a quick fly out and hovered over where the tanks were. I couldn't see any ruins, not to say there's nothing there, but I couldn't see any. I flew back out and down the valley to the first cottage, and from up here you can really see just how isolated it is, sitting amongst the trees and surrounded by the bush. It's also easier to imagine just how different this place would have looked when the valley was being worked. If you look to the right hand side or the middle of the screen here, you can see that straight line. That is actually the slate line, one of the slate line channels, irrigation channels running through there. And you can see the water is being directed through there. I thought I'd see if I could sneak the drone in under the trees where I believed the channel, slate line channel was, and yeah, sure enough, you could see them and start to appreciate just how far they run through the valley. They weren't just little drains; they're quite reasonable size, and you can imagine them running through the whole area. They were all part of the system Giles used to harness the water here and feed the gardens and orchards and the nurseries he'd established throughout the valley. And considering this was all built more than 170 years ago, using what they had around at the time, it's pretty impressive. Today, water's still finding its way through some parts of the channel that are still working, and the gardens, even though the gardens are all gone, the channels are still there. After flying the drone, I pack everything up and start making my way back out. By this stage, I've pretty much accepted that I'm not going to find any more of the ruins today. I've had a good look around. I've pushed out as far as I can into the other valley, and I think I've probably done enough fighting with blackberries for one afternoon. I head back past the first ruins and start to follow the valley back out. But then, just a little further along, I notice more stonework amongst the trees, and there it is, another cottage ruin. I'd actually walked pretty close to this earlier without even noticing it, so of course I had to go and have a look. Standing around in these old walls, it's easy to concentrate just on Giles and the business he created, but there were other people who made this place work as well. Gardeners, labourers and their families. They lived down here, and that's probably the part of the story I find most interesting. These weren't just ruins back then, they were people's homes. Families would have lived in these little cottages while the men worked in the gardens, orchards and nurseries around. There would have been children growing up here as well, and living in a fairly isolated valley in the Adelaide Hills in the 1800s. It would have been very different as a childhood to one that we know today. Getting to school, getting supplies, even just getting in and out of here would have taken some effort. It's strange looking at these old photographs and then standing amongst the remains of places like this. You start thinking less about the stone walls and more about the people who once called this valley home. After getting home and looking into the site a bit more, I'm actually not completely convinced I failed to find the 3 cottages after all. The cottages known as Hope, Faith and Charity were grouped together rather than being scattered all over the valley as I'd originally imagined. That first ruin also appeared to contain 3 separate sections or rooms, so it's possible that what I was actually looking at was more of the original cottage group than what I realised at the time. And this other ruin nearby may actually be the other western cottage that's supposed to be there. I'll need to do a bit more research before I'm prepared to say exactly which ruin is which, but either way, I found a lot more down here than I expected. From here, it's time to head back up the valley. The light's starting to fade, the kangaroos are starting to come out, and the old burnt trees along the track make the place feel even quieter than it did when I first came in. It's interesting to think about how different this valley must once have sounded. People working, children and families living down here, tools being used and water running through the channels, a working nursery and gardens hidden away in these hills. Now, more than 170 years later, the Reedbeds are quiet again. The gardens have disappeared, the cottages are slowly crumbling, and the bush is taking the valley back. There's just the rustle of the leaves, the water moving through the creek, and the sound of the birds settling in for the night. But if you know where to look, there's still a few little pieces of Giles Valley hidden in amongst the trees, and I'm pretty glad I came down here to find them.